As Japan lay in ruins after its surrender in 1945, a different kind of war began. One not fought with bombs or bullets, but with tribunals and hangingman's nooses. The Allied powers, determined to bring justice for the atrocities committed across Asia and the Pacific, turned their attention to the men who had led Japan into its most devastating war. Military generals, government ministers, and even former prime ministers were hunted down, imprisoned, and in many cases, executed. What followed was a ruthless reckoning, a legal purge meant to punish, but also reshape Japan's future. This is the story of what happened to Japan's wartime leaders after surrender. The trials, the executions, the political deals, and the historical scars that still linger. By mid-1945, Japan was on the brink of total collapse. Cities were destroyed by firebombs, food was running out, and the country was exhausted after years of war. Then came the final blows. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading from the north. With no options left, Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945. After the surrender, Allied forces led by the US occupied Japan. Their goal was not only to rebuild the country, but also to punish those responsible for starting and running the war. This included military leaders, government officials, and anyone involved in planning or carrying out war crimes. The Allies believed that holding these leaders accountable was necessary for peace and justice. To do this, they created a special military court to put Japan's top leaders on trial. What followed was a long and controversial legal process that would decide the fate of those who had once ruled an empire. After Japan's surrender, the Allies set up the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, better known as the Tokyo Trials. These trials, held from 1946 to 1948, were Japan's version of the Nuremberg trials in Europe. Their purpose was to judge the country's top military and political leaders for crimes committed during the war. The accused were divided into three classes. Class A, leaders who planned or started the war. This included former prime ministers, generals, and top officials. Class B, people responsible for war crimes, like the mistreatment of prisoners or civilians. Class C, those guilty of crimes against humanity, such as torture, slavery, and mass killings. In total, 28 men were charged as Class A war criminals. The trial lasted more than 2 years and included testimony about horrific events like the Nanjing Massacre and the Bataan Death March. While many supported the trials, others criticized them. Some called it victor's justice, since only the losing side was punished. Others argued that the trials were rushed, unfair, or influenced by politics, especially decisions to protect Japan's emperor from prosecution. Still, the Tokyo trials marked a major moment in history. For the first time, world leaders faced real consequences for starting a war and committing atrocities. The Tokyo trials ended in death sentences for 7 of Japan's most powerful wartime leaders. These were not ordinary men. They had once commanded armies, signed declarations of war, and made decisions that led to the deaths of millions. Now, they stood before international judges, stripped of rank, awaiting their end. Hideki Tojo. Tojo was perhaps the most well-known face of Japan's wartime government. As prime minister from 1941 to 1944, he oversaw the attack on Pearl Harbor and the early victories of Japan's empire. After surrender, he tried to take his own life with a pistol when American soldiers came to arrest him, but he survived. At his trial, Tojo accepted full responsibility, though he insisted he had acted in Japan's interest. He was found guilty of waging aggressive war and ordering inhumane treatment of prisoners. He was executed by hanging on December 23, 1948. Koki Hirota. Hirota was a diplomat and civilian leader, not a general, but he served as foreign minister and prime minister during Japan's military expansion into China. He was convicted for failing to stop the military's actions, especially atrocities like the Nanjing massacre, even though he was not directly involved. His execution sparked controversy, as some felt he was a scapegoat. Still, he was among the 7 hanged. Iwane Matsui and Akira Muto. Matsui commanded the troops that took Nanjing, where an estimated 200,000 civilians were raped, tortured, and murdered. Muto was convicted for war crimes in the Philippines, including the horrific Manila Massacre. Both men were executed for their roles in mass atrocities. Kenji Doihara, Seishiro Itagaki, Heitaro Kimura. These generals helped plan Japan's invasions and oversaw brutal occupation regimes in China and Southeast Asia. Doihara was deeply involved in drug trafficking and secret operations in Manchuria. Itagaki and Kimura led forces responsible for widespread atrocities. Their executions were swift and secretive. The Allies cremated the bodies and scattered the ashes in Tokyo Bay, ensuring no grave could become a place of honor. For many around the world, it was a powerful message. Leaders who start wars and commit crimes will face justice, even if it comes at the end of a rope. While some leaders were executed, many others received long prison sentences. These men were still held responsible for war crimes, but the tribunal decided their actions didn't justify death. Over time, however, many of them were released early. Koichi Kido was Emperor Hirohito's top advisor and a key political figure during the war. He was found guilty of helping organize Japan's military government, but was not directly involved in battlefield crimes. Sentenced to life in prison, Kido served just over 6 years before being released in 1953 due to poor health. He died a few years later, quietly and away from the public eye. Shunroku Hata. A senior army commander, Hata led forces in China, where widespread atrocities occurred. At trial, he was sentenced to life, but paroled in 1954. After his release, he lived a private life until his death in 1962. Like others, he avoided public attention after prison. Other notable cases. While many of the most well-known figures were generals or close to the emperor, several other important political and diplomatic leaders also faced justice, though with different outcomes. Mamoru Shigemitsu, a foreign minister who signed Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri, was sentenced to 7 years. He was released in 1950 and later returned to politics. Toshio Shiratori, a wartime diplomat and close ally of Tojo, received a life sentence but died in prison. Shumi Okawa, a political philosopher accused of promoting war, was declared mentally unfit and released early. His bizarre behavior during the trial, including slapping Tojo in court, raised doubts about his sanity. By the 1950s, shifting global politics, especially the rise of communism and the Cold War, led the U.S. to support Japan's rebuilding. As part of this, many war criminals were quietly pardoned or paroled. Though they had escaped execution, their reputations were forever stained. Not all of Japan's wartime leaders were punished equally. While many were imprisoned or executed, others avoided harsh sentences due to political strategy, personal health, or even convenience. The biggest example was Emperor Hirohito. Though he was the symbolic head of Japan's military during the war, he was never tried or punished. The U.S. believed that keeping the emperor in place would help maintain order during the occupation. General Douglas MacArthur, head of the Allied forces in Japan, saw Hirohito as a tool for peaceful rebuilding. So the emperor was protected and continued to rule in a symbolic role. Some leaders avoided trials due to poor health or mental instability, such as Shumei Okawa, who was removed from the courtroom and never returned. Others were spared execution because they cooperated with the Allies, showed remorse, or played roles in the post-war government. There were also practical reasons. As the Cold War began, the US needed Japan as a strong ally in Asia against the Soviet Union. Harsh punishments became less of a priority. In the end, justice was not always about guilt. It was sometimes about politics and timing. The trials and punishments of Japan's wartime leaders left a deep and lasting mark, not just on the individuals involved, but on Japanese society and world history. In Japan, public opinion was divided. Some believed the leaders got what they deserved. Others saw the trials as unfair, pointing to the fact that no Allied leaders were tried for bombings of civilian cities like Tokyo or Hiroshima. This gave rise to the idea of victor's justice, the belief that the trials were more about revenge than fairness. Over time, some Japanese politicians and groups began to question or even defend the wartime leaders, visiting shrines where war criminals were honored. This continues to cause controversy, especially with countries like China and South Korea that suffered under Japan's wartime actions. Despite the debate, the Tokyo trials set an important legal precedent. Leaders can be held personally responsible for war crimes. That idea would later influence trials in places like Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. The shadow of those trials still hangs over Japan's modern politics and memory of the war. The end of World War II was not just a military defeat for Japan, it was a moral reckoning. The trials, imprisonments, and executions of its leaders showed the world that those in power could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. Yet justice was shaped as much by politics as by principle. Some escaped punishment, others were made examples. Japan was forever changed, but so was the world's idea of wartime justice. Was it true justice, or simply history written by the winners?